Hello, and welcome to Race and Racism Lecture 9, starting with the preliminaries. Myths come in many forms. They're familiar sort of jargon that we use to describe allegories and analogies that we often find ourselves with. They're often used to explain phenomena. For instance, the Greeks believed that thunder was best explained by Zeus riding a chariot through the sky. Explanations, these things are often taught directly or indirectly to children. And if they're not met with counter evidence, then they just continue chugging along, right? And they're reinforced over time by that lack of evidence or counter evidence. Here's one way in which this happens. So suppose I walk into a classroom and I just say, I saw someone crying in the hallway. I hope they're okay. You probably wouldn't really question what I said, especially if I then moved on to discuss other course material. You would probably just assume I was telling the truth. This is, in fact, pretty frequent. In conversations, we often just assume that people are telling us the truth, and we allow that information into what we can call here the conversational common ground without careful scrutiny. And we're not always attentive. Like in this case, I could have been lying about seeing anybody, but we're not always attentive in general to what enters the common ground. And this is for good reason. I mean, if we scrutinized everything, like every single thing that came in or could potentially be accepted in conversation, those conversations would not go very smoothly. So it makes sense that we sort of have a default assumption that people are telling the truth. Of course, some entries into the common ground should be scrutinized. If you overhear somebody, for instance, using a racial slur in conversation, you should say something, right? With caveats in place. If you're in danger, of course, don't. But the point here is that unchallenged slurs entered into the common ground. They cause serious psychological harm to listeners or people when they hear them. But this is magnified if it's not checked and just allowed in, under silence to the common ground. And one of the reasons why it is harmful is because common ground has an air of truth to it. And if people aren't responding or aren't rejecting it into the common ground, makes you a bit complicit. And of course, this comes by degrees, much like responsibility, right? Depending on how hard it would be or like difficult, whether you can respond to the slur, whether you'd be safe to. All of that is, of course, on the table, and it affects the degree to which you would be complicit or might be complicit. The point here just being, though, lack of scrutiny of harmful entry into the common ground is a partial explanation, at least, for why complicity or why complicity seems to carry the weight it does in examples like this. Now, entry into the common ground, as I mentioned, is just one way myths are sustained in conversations in particular, but myths are also found more broadly in media, taught by parents and friends, etc. And the longer they exist, as I mentioned, the more they seem true. Just like in the common ground, right? Common ground's unchallenged, seems true. Keeps chugging along, seems truer and truer and truer. You would have heard about it if it were wrong, right? Like this is the sort of guiding intuition for what I call epistemic inertia. Epistemic just means, that's a Greek word that means knowledge. And the inertia here is like, you know this stuff, right? You have a whole worldview in your head. And if things you knew or know are wrong, you would have heard that by now. You wouldn't be so successful in living the way you are. Now, epistemic inertia, as I'm using it here, is a description of how myths can be sustained over time and why they gain force when sustained. Again, they're taught to us by parents and educators, media, etc., and they're reinforced again and again. And they're not often met with counter myths or counter narratives. Now, even when they are, though, myths can sometimes be so ingrained that it's hard to recognize counter myths as legitimate challenges. And it's in particular easy to describe away counter examples or just like shrug them off. I'll give you some examples. Consider just the current realization over this past decade that police officers are targeting other races. Here's some commonplace, not common sense, commonplace responses to this sort of realization. I haven't heard about that, right? People do say this. Some people are isolated, and whether they're right or not, whether they that's not sort of the point here. This is their response. They might genuinely believe that. They also might reject specific targeting. They might say something like, no, they're not targeting other races more than they are white people. This is something that's commonly heard too. They might say something like this: police don't target races, they target crime, right? Like, that's where the crime is, right? This is something, again, you'll hear also, those people need law and order, with the emphasis on those people in exactly the sort of racially insensitive way that you might find it. Now, all of these, for one, let me say, none of these are good, but all of these are common responses. These are ways in which myths can be sustained that have been in place for many years, and can resist counter myths, right? Okay, here's the sort of counter story, the counter narrative. Look, police legitimately are targeting other races, and they're doing it intentionally, and they're doing it for racial reasons. That's the sort of narrative they're dealing with. And now the responses. Okay, if you're thinking that's not how the world works, right? Like, of course that's not how the world works. The world is not so bad. What do you say in response? Well, one, I hadn't heard about it. Two, no, that's not true. They don't do it any more than anybody else, or they target white people just as much, or that's not true. They target crime. That's what they're for, right? All of this stuff fits with that dominant narrative about like what the police officers do for a living, and basically puts the blame on the targets, right? Again, sustaining that epistemic inertia. Look, they're hard to undermine, these myths, because epistemic inertia is hard to undermine. People who believe these myths they're not just ignorant or misinformed. They have these epistemic resources available to resist counter myths and counter narratives. And they have readily available ways to explain away potential claims about what's going on that don't align with how they think the world works. People are inclined, very, very inclined, to paint a coherent picture of how the world works based on what they already believe. That is just a fact about us, and we will go through contortions to do it. Okay, now that was preliminaries. There's some conceptual analysis on the table, some stuff we can work with before we jump over here to Gooding-Williams. Look, myths, they inform a great deal of social and political life, and this is cross-cultural. Gooding-Williams' genealogical critique is a way in which he's going to uncover how powerful myths are and how much they influence us. It has three parts. First, he's going to expose the genealogy of racial representations, and then he's going to interpret them as social and political allegories, myths we live by, and then he's going to try to show you how to undermine those allegories. It's important here we should get clear on some of this terminology. So a genealogical critique is a way of focusing on the historical development of concepts. It's from Nietzsche and made more robust by Foucault in recent centuries. But the idea here is just for our purposes, observe. Like, concepts are not born out of nothing, right? They have long histories that are important to keep in mind. So you can see how you got there, for one, but also you can see the sort of varied influences they have on others and how they might influence you. Looking at racial representations out in the world doesn't give you much information about why they're harmful. They could be harmful, of course. You can talk to people about how this makes them feel, and you can see the harm, right? But it doesn't really explain the depths of the harm. For that, you need to go in a little more. You need to understand why the concepts are harmful, and how do we even have them. So when the exposition project is engaged in this is something of a historical approach, right? Like, you look back at how we got here, and you can, and Gooding-Williams is going to look at media themes, like in movies, and see how these themes have promulgated themselves, these racial representations, that is, promulgated themselves through that lens. One of his examples is the movie Ghost, when Patrick Swayze dies, and he has to I believe it's Demi Moore. He's trying to stave off some bad thing from happening to Demi Moore, I believe. And Whoopi Goldberg plays a sort of soothsayer or a seer who can see him, and is provides some contact between the afterlife and the material world. Gooding-Williams' discussion here, though, is focused on how Whoopi Goldberg's character is really just dispensable. It's just a tool, and on the way to regime reclamation, right? Um, the implication of the story is that Patrick Swayze would have succeeded. He would have been victorious without Whoopi Goldberg. We can add here, and we should. This is from Fricker's discussion of Tom Robinson from Harper Lee's novel To Kill a Mockingbird. Remember, we were discussing how Tom is a gardener. He could, people would listen to him about gardening. That was his area of expertise. But here's this thing they were not going to listen to him about. His testimony about his innocence. They were not up for that. Instead, they imposed on him a sort of ability to do something impossible, all to fit that narrative that they had, the jurors did, about justice. Somebody has to pay. You're the culprit, right? That's again a myth, right? Embedded in here, and it's complicated because we have a very complicated relationship with the law and crime in general, and vengeance and whatnot. But here it's on point, right, to note that the jurors, it seems almost hard to deny that they are attributing some sort of supernatural capability to Tom, all for the purposes of fitting this narrative and making him in that way dispensable. Now, again, keep that in mind as we move on to the next part of the genealogical critique. This is where we interpret these representations as social and political allegories. I was gesturing at this a little, but now let's make it a little more concrete. What bridges these stories is that other races are for the dominant classes whatever they need. They're not essential. They're useful. That's it. And they're used because of it. Members of marginalized groups are always the supporting cast or supporting characters for the victors who use them. History is written by the victors, right? The implicit thought here being that individuals should be grateful they can play such a role. Now, this country was built on the backs of slaves, right? That that cannot be denied, and yet it so frequently is. Now, we'll come here to probably the most difficult part of the reading, mostly because allegories are so well entrenched. So Gooding Williams is suggesting that we undermine these myths, and I think this is exactly what we should do. And one way is by reinterpreting available myths. And an example provided here is that of the students after the LA riots. Now, the LA riots, if you're unfamiliar, this is Rodney King. This is on the cusp of Rodney King being beaten by police officers, being caught on tape, and made the rounds. The police officers were not they were let off. Certainly not punished as nearly as much as they should have been. And then riots broke out, like terrible riots. Many people, I believe 62 people died during these riots. And the sort of response to this that Gooding Williams was exposed to, at least in the university, was this effigies, these sort of dolls hung up, black dolls hung up with red paint splattered on the ground. And when Gooding Williams came across this, he thought, some white supremacist nonsense, right? So, wow, how offensive. And until he got closer, and his colleagues got closer, and they started reading some of the articles that were put up, and it became clear that this sort of demonstration wasn't through the mouthpiece of white supremacists. This is a sort of symbol, this deeply embedded racial insensitivity and targeting that's going on. It was going on in LA at the time. Again, the point here being one way to undermine these myths is by reinterpreting the ones that are already available for the purposes of shining a light on present behavior using by flipping dominant myths. Now, some questions worth considering, and some we'll discuss in class. Just how appropriate, or is it appropriate, you think, to use this lynching terminology, even then or now, because it happens now, to describe police behavior? Keep in mind the weight of what that is. Just think about whether you think it's appropriate to bring all that to bear on police behavior, then or now. Now, also think about who's the audience for this sort of demonstration that Gooding Williams relates. Is it the broader public? Is it just people at the university? Who would this be most effective for, and who would it not? Keep in mind how complex it was, right? Gooding Williams, his initial thought was this is emerging from a place of hate, right? So that takes a bit of sophistication to think through. Now, what is this last point now? Williams suggests that presenting powerful counter myths will undermine the harmful myth-sustaining systematic oppression. Now, I think this strikes me, at least, as a rather rational way to approach these myths. But I have a little bit of disconnect here, because myths aren't really rational. We don't get them rationally. We often don't decide on them. We find ourselves with them, and it's hard for me to think that they would be resolved with rational methods. So do you think, just ponder this, if you will, and we can talk more later, do you think this suggestion is effective, like this sort of like approaching countering myths in a rational way? And if not, how would we proceed? Okay, this leads us rather naturally, I think, because there's some answers over here to Ellison, That Same Pleasure and That Same Pain, which is an interview, a collection of essays of his. We pull out some major themes. So, again, building on our previous discussion, social and political allegories, they emerge not only from interactions with dominant groups, but also from your home environment, where you're raised. Ellison reflects on becoming aware as a child growing up in Oklahoma. There were days you could wear your Sunday clothes and days which you couldn't. It's sort of like you occupy different space. Now, Ellison learned this difference, much like Du Bois before him, when he was met with limitations on his freedom from the outside. Now, at the time, he was raised in an environment, like early in his childhood, he was raised in an environment that cultivated a sort of disposition to push back on limits, like see how far you could go. This was the mentality that his parents had. He learned to put on different coats or wear different masks, but he kept his eyes on the time when he could wear what he wanted, when he wanted. Like, that was the goal. Now, at the time, Oklahoma, when he was growing up, Oklahoma wasn't a slave state, and it had no history of slavery. He had received an education up until 12th grade, and unlike many of his peers, he didn't need to go back home to other southern states during the summer to work in cotton fields, and this was common. And surprisingly, perhaps he claims he was enviable of the students who did. And why? Well, he said it's because the students returned with stories not of like pain and hard labor, but of communion. And few adults wanted to talk about, in his community at least, wanted to talk about working with cotton, because that was the life of the Old South. They wanted to leave it behind. But the children, after working over the summers, they would come back and return stories of communities that he found missing in his life. And really, I'll just quote him here. They brought back jokes. Like, here's one example. They brought back jokes, our Negro jokes, not jokes about Negroes told by white people. And they brought back folk stories, stories he'd never heard before. And they returned and related to Ellison a culture he felt connected to, one which he'd been disconnected from, one which he only kind of caught out of the corner of his eye, and he knew people didn't want to talk about. But here he has children, like his peers, coming and telling him these stories. It brings a sense of connectedness that he just hadn't had. He seemed also to suggest in this interview that he learned of racial injustice largely from limitations, not in his, like, what he could do for a living or from his parents or, like, where he could go. Although I should say at the same time, he sort of seems, I don't know, he says it, it's a little complicated because he says he wasn't, like, civil rights weren't really something he thought a lot about, despite the fact that his mother was, like, incarcerated, like, every other day, he said, for, like, violating some ordinance about where she could be. So there's a bit of a disconnect in a couple of ways for Ellison. But it does seem to be the case that he, or at least as far as he understands it, he learned of, like, racial injustice largely from limitations on his art. So what he valued, what he wanted to do in the history of artistic representation. And through this lens, he started to see perspective others lacked. And that, like, this liberal idea of colorblind idealism that sort of, like, ensconced in Oklahoma at the time was not really a worthy goal. And this is fascinating. Ellison was sort of disconnected from this culture that some of his peers were exposed to and relating to him. And at the same time, like, he was seeing, like, limitations on freedom through his mother and people in his life, but and very likely from himself, like, outside of art. It wasn't, like, resonating so strongly with him until it came into conflict with something that he valued more than anything, right? Like his artistic expression. That's when it becomes real for him. But at the same time, as he becomes mature, he's not sure that black individuals had ever had the opportunity to sit back and relax and just like identify what aspects of that culture are worth preserving. It's important to keep in mind, though, I mean, can't belabor the point enough that he's looking at this from the outside. Like he's seeing it from the outside looking in. He's seeing the sort of struggle and the difficulty and all the frequency with which reaction is the way you engage in art, and not like that, as Locke might say, like art for its sake, right? Find yourself through artistic expression, and not as a reaction, not as Dubois might say, like as always being propaganda. Now, it's also, I think I pulled this out, it's also worth pointing out that Ellison doesn't seem to have much room for blame in how he views the world. I don't read much blame at all in his interviews. I read pointing to wrongdoing, but not blame. He's far more focused, it seems, on self and cultural enlightenment. Now, it's important, I can't forget, and I don't want you to either, the voice of George James, who we haven't read, but I've brought up several times, who asks, at always at points like this, where does that desire for self and cultural enlightenment come from? And the answer seems to be from the colonizer, right? That's where those values come from: enlightenment, freedom, wealth. That's where they come from. They come from the same source. So Ellison is saying we've never had the culture hasn't had a time or had any time of respite to sit back and see what's valuable, what we want to keep. And George James is saying you should be skeptical that any of it's worth keeping, right? Like, this is something, though, that for Ellison, though, the black population in the U.S. at the time had enough space to even consider whether this claim by James might be true. Now, I will say Ellison is optimistic, more optimistic than most with respect to art. He thinks it's a means by which one can understand their values outside of reaction. He thinks this for, reasons that we've seen before. Art reveals what's permanent and unchanging and universal, right? It conveys that same pleasure, that same flame, the unity of us all. Now, he focuses a lot on music, so I don't want to overlook this. I want to try to extract something valuable, I think, from this conversation about jazz and music that he doesn't really touch on, but I think it's here. So there is something about music that conveys knowledge. We are pattern recognizers, and music exhibits patterns, and as a matter of fact, patterns seem true or real or important to us. This is studied, pretty well studied. Rhymes sound more true than other things, right? Repetition sounds more true. You see this in rhetoric all the time. Like, people repeat. They'll say the sort of same structure of the beginning of a paragraph or the beginning of a set of sentences that they want to like just land and feel more forceful. That force. I mean, we're wired to think that sort of repetition, that sort of rhyming when we see it, is somehow more important, right? Because patterns, we love patterns. Music, it might provide, if we're just thinking about where Ellison's coming from, a vehicle for understanding one's values and presenting those values to others. If you really think that music, like the study of music, the deep reflections on what's universal about it, might help you reveal like your enlightened self to others, whether it be as an individual or as a culture, that's one step. The next, though, is conveying it to other people to bridge these gaps in understanding in music. Music is a way, surprisingly perhaps, you can do that because music is patterns. Think about this. You know the lyrics to songs you don't know you know. You've been in this situation. As soon as the music hits, that's my jam. You're like, oh my God, I can't believe I know all the songs I can't believe I know all the lyrics to like Mambo Number 5 or something, but you do. That's a lot of information to encode. It's because it's put in a nice patterned bow. Look, remember, there are many ways to sustain myths. Few people reject music wrapped in lovely melodies from adding statements into a common ground. And when they do, they gain credibility when they're there. You can sneak in knowledge. You can sneak in information, maybe by building narratives into your music. Information about individuals or cultures or groups, who you are in your music. And then once it's picked up, once it's taken up by your listeners, you can get them to know it without knowing that they're knowing it, bypassing all their defenses. Music allows access to values of self and cultural enlightenment. for putting this all together and encodes knowledge about those values to others. This is what Ellison is suggesting. It can be a vehicle for those values, conveying knowledge to others surreptitiously, building surprising bridges between disagreeing groups, and so perhaps provides a strategy for undermining harmful myths, racial representation by bypassing epistemic inertial resistance. This is the point to take away. Now, lastly, let's talk about how Italians became white. Today it's considered insensitive, a glorification of a murder of vast numbers of indigenous people. It's a stark representation of colonialism. It's also an example of how social and political allegories influence understanding. Now, Columbus was valorized as an example of an Italian American. And it's important to understand how this day came about and why it has the importance it does for many people. It was a response to the long history of anti-Italianism in the U.S., as a matter of fact. Post-Civil War, many Italian Americans were placed in enslaved groups of peoples in southern plantations and were treated very poorly. Italian Americans were the targets of the largest lynchings in the U.S., or the largest lynching in the U.S. in 1911. It was 11 people. They were among the targets of the newly reformed KKK in 1915. They were placed in internment camps alongside others from Axis countries during World War II, or suspected of being from Axis countries during World War II. To be fair, some parts of the U.S. celebrated Columbus as an Italian American, and his landing as far back as 1792. And Columbus Day, but note, it's a long time between this and Columbus Day being recognized as a one-time federal holiday after the lynchings in 1911, mostly as a way to alleviate tensions with Italy. Italy was like, what the hell are you doing, U.S.? You're letting this happen to our citizens, or people from our country. Should we step in? Like the Italian embassy stepped in after this and was like, okay, this has gone too far. Columbus Day was recognized here as a one-time federal holiday after the lynchings as a way to alleviate tensions. But it didn't become a federal holiday until 1968 after years of petitioning by Italian-American groups. Columbus was, to these individuals, an indication of how deeply ingrained Italians were to the country and how they were essential, not dispensable. Remember that. Remember the myths, right? This sort of myth of dispensability. But it's true. If we want to build a narrative of the U.S. and its development, we wouldn't have done it without Columbus. Right. Now, I'm not saying that's the best way to do it. Of course not. But if that's your myth, if that's your narrative, then you got to admit, right? And what is this but like a retelling or a reinterpretation of that old myth that prioritizes or shows or demonstrates the value, or at least this at the time, a way to demonstrate how valuable, how essential this group of people was to the building of your myth, your country. Columbus was for a way for Italian Americans to push back on these harmful social and political myths prevalent in the country. This, I think, is some of the reason why there's so much pushback from Italian Americans today about Columbus Day. As many of them are old enough to remember the discrimination and the achievement, and most importantly, certainly this is true, many of them are old enough to remember the achievement of having a national holiday. Now, this is not to say that we should celebrate Columbus Day. I do not think we should. I think we are right not to. But it is important to say, to understand at least, why some people find it so important. And it's important we understand the use of counter-narratives to undermine social and political allegories, even if those narratives aren't perfect. Decades ago, too, you might not have realized that how harmful the things Columbus did were and what he was responsible for. This is not actually obvious, by the way. It's not really obvious what he did. Don't get me wrong, he did a lot of things worth blame, but it's not always clear what exactly it was, because there was serious misinformation campaigns by Spain. Literacy wasn't as high as it is now when Italian Americans were pushing for this holiday, and their groups were too. There also wasn't internet. There were a few reasons to think that maybe it wasn't obvious how harmful his behavior was. That doesn't really excuse, though, the significant pushback from Italian-American groups in the U.S. today, and I'm not trying to excuse it, okay? Like I said, I don't think we should celebrate this day. They do know better, I think. And even more important, just as importantly, I suppose, there are many other Italian-Americans worth celebrating, like Dr. Fauci. Come on, like Fauci. The point here is just, though, the importance of understanding why others might hold what seem to be obviously harmful beliefs, I think is crucial, especially in these hard conversations. We have to leave space for that. I think people try to be reasonable for the most part. And they have reasons for why they do what they do. We might disagree. We often do disagree with them. But it doesn't mean they don't have reasons and we can't talk to them about those reasons. Now, we should also be careful not to judge people who are persecuted so severely for what they did to undermine that persecution. It's hard to understand, but many of us don't have to deal or haven't had to deal with this sort of persecution. So we should be open to different tactics or different strategies. If we are going to judge, we should be careful so that we have a better picture about why they did what they did. And genealogy, the genealogical critique approach can help us understand that from many ways. Hopefully I've illustrated that here, both for undermining like racial representations that are bad and should be undermined, but also for outlining why things that are done might be motivated out of persecution or might be motivated as a way to push back on persecution in the past. Now, they may not be useful now, but at least we have a deeper understanding of how we got here, and that is the crucial point. Now, the people can be wrong, other groups can be wrong, other myths can be wrong for celebrating and valorizing what they do, but understanding these points will help us understand where our values align.